host of a show about mysteries, legends, and the macabre, it should come as no surprise that I love scary stories, the kind that keep most people awake at night. And of all the stories and legends out there, vampires have always been my favorite. My library is full of books, poems, and movies about these immortal creatures of the night. I first read Bram Stoker's Dracula in middle school, and then devoured the movies, from Bela Lugosi's 1931 portrayal of Count Dracula to later interpretations by Frank Langella and Christopher Lee, and more recently the 1992 release of Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and starring Gary Oldman as the Count himself. So, imagine my delight when, at an author's event in 2016, I happened to meet the grandnephew of Bram Stoker, Dacre Stoker. Dacre has written books, given presentations in North America and in Europe, and has appeared on a variety of television programs talking about his famous ancestor and the immortal story that he penned. Today, he joins me on a very special episode of Stories, Secrets, and Sagas. Dacre, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. I'm so excited to have you here.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here.
Oh, yay.
Yeah.
Well, looking back over everything with your history, your connection with Bram Stoker has certainly opened a world of adventure for you.
It has. Coming from a coach who has traveled the world, at the Olympic level and as a school teacher, but this is completely different. This is sort of my dark side.
Yes.
The real adventurous side, places I haven't been before, but it really is exciting.
So what began your foray into the world of Dracula?
Well, as a kid growing up in Montreal, Canada, Halloween was the season when it was brought to my attention, the Stoker thing. Kids would joke, and it got a little bit boring after a while. What's going to happen when we come to your house? Is it going to be candy or blood? So, that was sort of the 70s when the world was, the eyes were opening up to who Bram was. Everybody knew Dracula for many years.
Right.
But a book that came out by McNally and Florescu, In Search of Dracula, really started pointing the eyes of the scholars to my great-granduncle. And that also helped him, become more known to myself and the rest of the family, because we really didn't know that much about Uncle Bram until my dad pulled out this edition of Dracula and said, I think it's now time to tell you what's going on. And of course, it wasn't just Dracula. Bram wrote many other stories.
Right.
But the interesting thing was really, Jamie, again, there was no autobiography. There had been a few biographies written, a few family stories, but really not enough to sort of really sink your teeth into until I got a call from a guy, Ian Holt, to want to get involved to write a sequel. And that was about 2003, and it finally got published in 2009 with a lot of research in between. And that's when I started delving into, the family, his great-grandsons living in England, who actually invited me over, and it was in one of those places, the Isle of Wight, where I found that one of them had a journal of Bram's. And this was sort of the holy grail, because people up at that point had known there was the Dracula notes, 125 pages in the Rosenbach Museum, but nothing really source-like that Bram had written telling us his thoughts on things. And so I published that along with Elizabeth Miller, and that sort of put me on the stage, so to speak, as a person who knows what he's doing. And then other things started rolling, these lectures, the presentations around the world. But at the same time, I'd keep digging. My wife and I put out a Bram Stoker estate webpage. We represented our cousins in merchandising and licensing Bram. And again, one thing would lead to another, and it would get me more invitations to go to really cool places. People would contact me and say, I'm doing research about this. I heard Bram was in Scotland at this theater, and we just found something. What do you think? And then I would be able to put the pieces together. And that was really fun, was I may not be the source of all information, but I began to be the clearinghouse, which meant I was right in the middle of neat things. Being asked to write introductions and forwards to books gave me more insight into sort of research and stuff like that.
Cool. Well, you mentioned a lot of the presentations you give. Your Stoker on Stoker presentation has become wildly popular, not just in North America, but in Europe too. doing this, what are some of the more memorable places that you've been able to travel?
Most recently, Romania has been a cool find. I bring people on trips there to show the places where the novel, Bram's novel, took place, and also where the real Vlad Dracula was. And I think the neatest thing, is sort of carrying on a legacy that Bram started. He never went to Transylvania, but his research was immaculate, and he got everything just right, from the way things looked, costumes. But the key thing is, this summer, my son and I and a guide and a few friends climbed Mount Israel in the Kalamanalui National Park. And the significance of that, Jamie, is that this is the place in Bram's notes that he left in kind of a cryptic way lines of longitude and latitude to show exactly where the intersect point was for the top of Mount Israel, which was an extinct volcano. And the reason that's also, this is like a big puzzle, that at the end of Dracula, before it was edited, there was a volcanic eruption at the time when the knife was thrust into Dracula's heart and he crumbled into dust. But his editor, or Bram, for whatever reason, we don't know it, had a massive volcanic eruption. And nobody other than Bram Stoker would have been so, just precise about this to make sure that that castle where that happened would have been on an extinct volcano if he was going to have a volcanic eruption.
Right. So speaking of these really neat adventures you've had in researching, you've had some pretty amazing adventures writing or co-authoring and researching your latest novel, Dracula, that you wrote with J.D. Barker.
Right. I mean, this is a prequel. I sort of did things backwards. Did a sequel first, because that seemed easier and had that sort of an idea in my mind to continue the story. The prequel, though, Jamie, is all about Bram's life, and I learned a lot, as I've been mentioning, about his self, growing up, this childhood illness in Dublin. How did he, make this miraculous recovery? How did he become a champion athlete? And as I learned more of that to put into my Stoker on Stoker, I began to realize that this needs to be brought to the greater public. And the best way, as you very well know yourself as an author, is to fictionalize it and to kind of give it some juice, give it some spice. So not to say Bram's life was that boring as it was, but nowadays you need to have some really good action. So first of all, finding a really good thriller horror writer, J.D. Barker, to help me do it was critical. And once we got that, it was, all right, what documents speak to us? And it was things like the Icelandic preface of Dracula, which was recently discovered, which talks about the book being very real. And so we decided to sort of make the premise of Dracula, the prequel, that Bram Stoker had some reason, I'm not going to give any spoilers, some reason for making the story Dracula real, and a real warning to people that vampires are a force to be reckoned with, not just in the storybooks. And so that took us to, itself to a number of places. And one in particular was to Seattle, Washington, where Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder, luckily he's purchased and preserved and makes available to authors the Dracula typescript. Now the typescript has a cool provenance of its own. It's a manuscript. It's the last piece of work that Bram put his hands on. Luckily, it's typed, so therefore we can read his writing. But it's also, that's why it's called a typescript. Somehow Bram gave this copy to a guy called Donaldson. Mr. Donaldson was a lawyer and a friend of Walt Whitman. Bram and Whitman were good friends.
Really?
And they exchanged correspondence. And Bram decided, and I believe it's because Donaldson delivered to Bram Walt Whitman's notes on Abraham Lincoln. Whitman gave lectures on Lincoln, and Bram thought Lincoln was really quite special. So he wanted to give lectures himself in England. So the notes went back and forth, and in return, Bram gave the Dracula typescript. Unfortunately, Whitman had died, and so they ended up just with Donaldson. They ended up in a barn on his property. Decades later, when his family finally sold the place, it was then discovered in a trunk when they were clearing everything out. Of course, it went to, people, booksellers, and Paul Allen purchased it. And the key thing about that is when it was brought to the public's attention of what's this typescript all about, it starts on page 102. So there's 101 pages that were missing. And then 2 years after Bram had died, his wife published a short story called Dracula's Guest. And in the preface to that, she says, "This was excised from my husband's most famous book, Dracula. I hope you will like it."
Wow.
Now, it's only 17 pages. So that only accounts for some of the 101.
Right.
But any authors worth their salt who are writing a prequel, we better get ourselves out there and analyze this book, what is there, and see if that gives us any hints to what was taken out. And so what we were looking for when JD and I went out there, anything that was crossed out. Because our understanding was, and we were proven right, that this was the last piece of material that Bram had his hands on. There wasn't another, press the button and you make another copy on your laptop. So there were at least 3 things that we found that were crossed out of the typescript that were referred to in Dracula's Guest. So that confirms that Dracula's Guest was once a part of it. And it also confirms, as I mentioned earlier, that the very ending of Dracula that was crossed out on the pages, there was a big volcanic eruption. And of course, there was lots of other cool things, notes in the margins. Bram's oldest brother, who is featured in Dracula, Dr. William Stoker, famous doctor, he helped Bram with all the medical information, like how to do the blood transfusion, what sort of goes on in the operation that they had to do, Seward and Van Helsing had to do on Renfield, the brain surgery. So there was another good reason, well, if Thornley's involved, William Thornley's involved in Dracula, well, he better be involved in Dracula as well. So he becomes a major character. So that trip to Seattle was huge because it confirmed things that we thought about, we heard about rumors, and now we know it. And we have some ideas what was in the rest of the early part of the story, because it only begins, that we know, with Bram, in the train from sort of Vienna onwards. This story happens in Munich before that. So without giving away spoilers, our story ends in Munich, in the little unholy town where the action in Dracula's Guest begins.
Wow, that's so exciting. Now, I certainly love vampires, and I love Count Dracula, the whole legend. The tale seems to me to be quite an immortal tale. In your travels and your encounters with fans in all your presentations and everything you've done, why do you think there's such an appeal for Count Dracula?
Well, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head with the word immortal. Everyone around the world at some time, I would put good money on it, has thought about what happens when I die and what would happen if I didn't die. Maybe I'm the one guy that gets to live forever, or some version of that. So it's in people's consciousness, and there's a lot of proof to that. When people started doing a lot of writing in the medieval days, there were certain treaties and certain documents that were found that were worrisome things that were happening, and we now realize what they were. It was contagious diseases like the plague and cholera and different fevers going through Europe. The problem was people were interpreting that without a scientific background. The easiest way to explain the unexplained was some sort of superstition. And Bram found, as we all know nowadays, that almost every culture in the world has some version of a creature not at rest, the soul not at rest, that comes out from the dead and takes the life out of the living. And so some people, they have many different names. Vampire is one of the most common, but many different versions of that. So, to me, a story that we fantasize with, a supernatural story that touches on something that is very real, resonates even stronger, as opposed to, Mary Shelley came up with an incredibly great idea years before Bram did with making Frankenstein different body parts. She was really advanced thinking about that. So that wasn't in consciousness. Nowadays we think of cloning and we go back to Mary Shelley and go, boy, she was onto something. But when Bram wrote vampire stories, that was something that people were very concerned about. And he wrote the book in real time. He wrote it with real places and real people, with real concerns in people's sort of in their minds and in their, their concerns.
Thank you so much
You're
for
most
talking
welcome.
with us. This is fantastic. Dracula is a timeless tale and has been reimagined over and over in each generation. I hope this episode of Stories, Secrets, and Sagas has inspired you to rediscover Count Dracula or encounter him for the first time. Whether it's reading Bram's novel, watching the iconic movies, or picking up one of Dacre's books to discover a new layer to the tale. As for me, I know what I'll be reading.